Welcome to the Terry Stanley channel. Today, I would like to introduce you to the story, When Birds May Sing. Author, South. Stars. Read by, Terry Stanley. May my heart always be open to little birds who are the secrets of living. E. Cummings. Percy was in love. He was sure. The unnerving beating, no, pounding, of his heart as a certain blonde skimmed past him in the uni library was downright ridiculous. As was the goofy grin he was desperately trying to keep down. She hadn't seen him yet, thank the gods, her head too absorbed in her newest book. That, and Percy would have to be someone entirely substantial to catch such a person's attention. Which, you are not. That was okay with him though. He could watch from a distance, no harm done. Said girl turned slightly in his direction, as though noticing eyes on her. Percy slammed the random textbook in front of him to his face, ducking behind it. Don't see me, don't see me, don't. He re-emerged at the sound of the bell tinkling as someone left, looking up just in time to see Princess Curls disappear around the corner, satchel stuffed full of books. Percy sighed like the absolute idiot he was. There was no doubt about it. He was in love. Percy was trying to be subtle. He really was, he swore. Dude, his friend, Grover, nudged him in the side. You look like a wannabe detective. Percy huffed, flipping the collar of his trench coat a little higher and adjusting his sunglasses. And, man, Grover sighed, you're inside. Percy glared at his friend, jabbing him in the side. Shut up, he hissed. You're drawing attention. Oh, I'm drawing attention. Percy elbowed him in the gut, Grover bending over double to rest his head against the worn cafe table, groaning softly. They had come here at 8 in the freaking morning, as Grover had so pointedly grumbled, to catch sight of a certain topic of Percy's thoughts. Whom he happened to know bought herself a flat white and a croissant every weekday morning. From this particular coffee shop. That they were now sitting in, inconspicuously drinking coffee in a side booth. Inconspicuous your foot. Percy pinched himself, shutting up the voice. He was simply taking precautions to make sure he wasn't recognized. Not that she'd recognize you, anyway. He checked his watch, 8:10. She was due in 5 minutes. Gods, he sounded like a creepy stalker. He swore he wasn't sure. He sank a little lower in his seat. It wasn't his fault that he had happened to overhear her recommending a particular coffee shop that she frequented every morning for the best coffee ever. And so maybe he waited around that coffee shop the whole day the next day just to see when she would show up, but he promised he wasn't a stalker. Percy eyed the sugar bowl in the middle of the table, glanced at Grover's exasperated face. Truth be told, he was starting to freak himself out a little, too. What, exactly, are you doing, Jackson? Percy sighed, defeated. Drinking coffee, he thought in despair. You hate coffee. Percy ignored himself, taking a small, reluctant sip of the bitter liquid and forcing it down. As if on cue, a bright voice cut through his thoughts, ordering a flat white, please. Thank you. Percy was completely composed. He promised. The girl's head turned around whilst she was waiting, calculating grey eyes taking in the little shop. Her gaze flew over everyone sitting and enjoying the brisk morning, including. Percy yelped, sliding himself directly under the table, sitting on his butt by Grover's knees, hidden by the bright tablecloth. Dude, he complained. What the hell are you doing now? Percy punched Grover's leg, ordering him to shut the hell up. He could just see him rolling his eyes, probably making direct eye contact with Miss freaking Annabeth Chase just for spite. Percy grumbled, covering his head with his hand so he wouldn't knock it against the bottom of the table. Is anyone sitting here? A light, warm voice inquired. Shit. He could distantly hear Grover's stuttering as he tried to come up with an excuse. He wasn't thinking anywhere near fast enough as Annabeth, gods, slipped into the booth where Percy had been sitting not 2 minutes ago. He shrunk back as far as he could against Grover's booth, bordering on hyperventilation whilst cursing his best friend and his own idiot brain to the high heavens. I'm so sorry to barge in, the voice continued kindly. There were no more seats left, and you looked the most friendly of this lovely morning bunch. She chuckled a little and Percy's heart stopped. He should really get that checked. Grover's nervous bleating filled the room. Yeah, that's fine. So okay. Annabeth breathed a laugh. Okay. Thank you? Oh. Grover. Percy could hear Grover's gulp from underneath the table. Percy shook his head. 21 years and his best friend still couldn't talk to pretty girls. Yeah, like you're one to talk, Mr. Hyde under the freaking table. That was so beside the point, he reassured himself. He was completely composed. And utterly mentally stable. And, for sure, not dying of multiple heart attacks at once as Annabeth tried to continue idle conversation with his best friend whilst he tried not to breathe under the table. Percy scrunched his eyes shut, praying for the gods to just smite him now and get it over with. It would be less painful. His prayers were answered, in a much less explosive way, when Annabeth slid gently from the booth. He checked his watch 10 minutes later. "Thank you so much, Grover," she was saying. "I guess I'll see you around." Percy peeked out from under the tablecloth to see her jean-clad legs hovering inches from his face. He instantly scrambled back, trying to be graceful and, goddammit, quiet. His back slammed into the wall, making a resounding bang. Percy cringed, staying absolutely still as he heard Grover above him slamming his elbow into the wall to mask the noise. Yeah, for sure. He coughed, bleating nervously. A small breath of a laugh and her shoes spun on their heel to exit the shop. Percy sunk down the wall until his back was on the floor, staring up at the table. He huffed out a breath, running a hand through his messy hair. Grover ducked his head to see him. "Dude. That's gross. Kids spit on that floor, man." Percy bolted upright, slamming his forehead against the table. "Ow, ouch." He was trying to be subtle. He swore. Percy was relaxed. Totally cool-headed. He even managed to actually breathe in his history lecture, listening for once to the droning voice of his professor rather than staring in a daze at a particular head of blonde curls a few seats in front of him. He had to pass this class. A very difficult feat when it contained certain distractions. But, no. He had promised his mum. He would not flunk any credits this semester. Not only could they not afford him to resit a subject, but he also, personally, couldn't afford to be stuck in a class without Annabeth, though truth be told, it would probably improve his grades. And Annabeth would be acing the class first time round, no questions asked. And so he tried, to pay close attention. He tagged the appropriate pages of his text for reading, took copious notes on his laptop, kicked his foot against the floor to keep it from falling asleep, and kept his eyes on the board ahead at all costs. In fact, he was paying so much attention to the monotonous voice of his professor that he neglected to notice someone sliding into the seat beside him. And such was why he nearly jumped into the ceiling when a soft voice asked, "Percy, right?" Percy gulped, his eyes darting to the side to see the girl mirror in chess from himself. To say he was thoroughly confused would be a severe understatement. She waved her hand in front of his face a little, snapping him out of his shock. He shook his head, blinking at her. Had she asked a question? Never mind, she whispered, facing back towards the front. Percy was still trying to comprehend how she had gotten up from 2 rows ahead to sit next to him, nonetheless why she would do such a thing. Percy, he stumbled pathetically. Stay cool, stay cool, stay cool. Annabeth turned her head back to him, smiling slightly. Annabeth, she introduced quietly. Percy gulped. I know. Annabeth's eyes widened before ducking her head slightly, letting one of her curls obscure her face. You're friends with Grover, right? Percy wanted to dig a hole and die. Of course she was asking about his best friend. Yeah, he mumbled miserably. Oh, good. I've got the right person. She looked relieved. Percy looked at her, confused. Right person? I'll talk to you after class. Grover mentioned you were interested in some tutoring? She looked at him nervously. Probably because he was currently frozen in place, with a most likely horrific expression on his face as what she said slowly sunk into his dense brain. "Grover, you sneaky son of a. Anyway, I'll leave you to your notes, though we covered all of this content 2 weeks ago, if you would remember, so there's no need to double up on writing." Percy twitched his fingers nervously. I like to be prepared. No way was he about to let her know that he had no clue what was covered in a lecture 2 weeks ago because of his fascination with someone's blonde, soft. Percy shook his head furiously. "Yeah," he whispered. "I'll see you after class." She smiled at him and Percy thought he might have died and gone to heaven. He was totally calm, he told himself, rubbing his sweaty hands on his jeans. Totally calm. She was waiting outside the lecture hall, leaning against the wall. Percy had to blink to make sure he wasn't hallucinating, because it was Annabeth Chase, standing in front of him, offering to tutor him. He was in Elysium. He must have been. Her eyes caught him stumbling out of the doorway and motioned him over. Percy gulped, shuffling his feet. "All right, let's do this quick. I have another class to get to." She smiled slightly but professionally, pulling a diary from her bag. "Which days work best for you?" Percy blinked unintelligently, staring at her long eyelashes as they fluttered with her movements. "Get a goddamn grip. Tuesday," he managed to stutter, tearing his eyes away to stare at the linoleum floor. He shifted his feet, taking in the holes in his battered Converse. He really needed new shoes. "Just Tuesdays?" Annabeth's voice broke him from his tangent. He opened his mouth, his eyes snapping up to hers. "And, Saturdays?" Annabeth nodded, jotting something down in her diary before slipping it away and grabbing her phone. "Perfect, Saturdays works best for me too, so we'll do it then. I'll just grab your number." Percy nearly fell over on the spot. She wanted his number? "I'll give you mine too," she continued. "Just in case something comes up and we have to change plans." Oh. Percy shut his gaping mouth and shook his head slightly, trying to get his bearings back. "Yeah, of course. For sure." He rattled off his number, watching as she put his contact under Perseus Jackson tutoring. It was impersonal and purely professional, sure, but Percy couldn't help but feel the elation stirring in his gut. His name, his freaking name, was in Annabeth Chase's contacts. He smiled goofily, making a mental note to thank Grover when he had the chance. Percy was not freaking out. He wasn't. Annabeth Chase tutor stared back at him, his finger hovering over the call button. It was Saturday. He glanced from the door he was standing in front of, to her contact on his phone, back to the door again. "Come on, Kelphead. Just knock." He brought his hand up in a fist, resting it lightly on the painted wood. Then drew it back again, placing his finger over the call button once more. He couldn't do this. His heart was in his throat and he hadn't even stepped foot inside her house. It was lined up to be an inevitable disaster. No way around it. He should just turn on his heel and retreat from her house, grab his bike and pedal the hell out of this neighborhood with big fancy houses that he so did not belong in. He shifted his feet nervously. He should leave. He should really leave. Before he embarrassed himself. Or, embarrassed himself even more like. He had already received a heavily judgmental glare from the cat across the street. His hand tightened on his book bag, its weight heavy on his shoulder. Call or door, call or door, call or door, call. He knocked. His hand retreated straight away, and he looked down at his fist in disbelief, letting out a small sound of protest. He did not just do that. "Coming!" yelled a distant voice from within the house. "Shit!" Percy glanced around himself like an idiot, frantically trying to smooth down his crumpled t-shirt and running his hands through his stubborn hair. He was midway through licking his hand in a last-ditch effort to pat his hair down when the door swung open, revealing a certain blonde dressed in trackies and a ginormous hoodie. Percy froze mid-lick. Annabeth looked at him quizzically. Percy straightened with a jolt, shoving his gross hand behind his back and subtly wiping it on his jeans. He knew he probably looked like a deer caught in the headlights, but he couldn't send his brain the message to move. You idiot. Act casual. Annabeth blinked once. Twice. Hi. Come on in. Don't mind the mess. Sorry, my little brothers are being crazy and my roommates just moved out, so I had to move back for a little bit. Percy stepped through the doorway, following her down a grand hall. He felt his mouth drop open, taking in the pristine floors, the high ceiling dotted with chandeliers, the artwork adorning the perfectly painted walls. He slowed his steps, feeling like an intruder. Should I take off my shoes? He asked quietly, staring self-consciously down at the mud-caked Converse. Annabeth flipped her hand in the air. Oh, no. Don't worry about it. The cleaner comes tomorrow anyway. Cleaner? Percy coughed awkwardly, mumbling an okay then before continuing behind her through to an open living room. Sunlight filtered through the huge windows, but there were no dust mites to be seen dancing in the rays. 3 massive, comfy-looking couches lined the walls, surrounding a TV bigger than Percy actually thought they could physically make them. He watched as Annabeth casually made her way to the couches, moving the coffee table slightly so that it was closer. Only then did he notice the papers spread across the surface and the pencils strewn around. Books piled high against the wall in a haphazard pile, folders and files littering every available surface. Annabeth wiped her arm across the coffee table, shoving all of her stuff to the side before looking over at him expectantly. Did you want a drink or anything before we stared, or are you right to just kick off? Percy blanked, making his way awkwardly towards her and sitting with his butt on the very edge of the couch, putting as much distance between them as possible. No, we can just start studying and tutoring and learning and stuff. He rubbed the back of his neck, cringing inwardly at himself. Annabeth slapped her knees, leaning forward to gather some textbooks. Great, she smiled chirpily. Ancient history. Let's begin with mythology. Percy thought his head might explode. Or implode. Whichever was more painful. Annabeth was rattling of paragraphs of information, asking him questions every 2 minutes, but he honestly couldn't even remember the last thing that came out of her pretty little mouth. Information overload. He groaned involuntarily, rubbing his temples in frustration. Percy? Annabeth looked up from the textbook. What vegetable was believed to contain the souls of the dead? Percy started eloquently. Grapes? Annabeth sighed, frowning a little. Beans. Close though. Percy flung himself backwards on the couch, way past caring that this was not his house and therefore he should at least try to act civilized. Especially in a big fancy mansion house. What's the use, Annabeth? My brain is exploding. You'll get there, she said softly, leaning forward to dive back into the textbook. He groaned slightly and she must have picked it up because she slowly closed the book on her lap, setting it aside and leaning back into the couch so she could catch his eye. Maybe we should have a break, she suggested. Percy thought he had never heard a better idea in his life. That would be great, he mumbled, burrowing further into the soft cushions. He was mortified, utterly mortified, that Annabeth had to see him like this, but he couldn't even bring himself to care. His head was pounding and gods, how did people fit all this information into their heads? I'm sorry, he whispered pathetically. She looked at him quizzically, raising an eyebrow over an intimidating grey eye. Why on earth would you be sorry? 'Cause I'm stupid, he mumbled miserably. And I can't concentrate for longer than 5 freaking minutes. He scrunched his eyes shut, not wanting to see the weirded-out expression most definitely adorning Annabeth's face. This was only his first tutor session and he had already screwed it up. He figured the only reason she hadn't kicked him out already was because he was paying for her help. You're not stupid, Percy, she sighed, standing to her feet. We just have to find the right learning style for you. Everyone's different. She started walking away, leaving him to sulk on the couch. Would you like some cookies? She called over her shoulder. Percy bolted upright, his foul mood momentarily forgotten. cookies?" he asked innocently. Gods, if he wasn't in love before then he definitely was now. "Yeah, choc chip," her voice floated from the kitchen. "Nothing special. Nothing special." His foot. "I love cookies," he grinned to himself, nodding slightly though she couldn't see him. Yes, he was in dire need of some tasty deliciousness to see through the massive head-pounding he had just received at the hands of a genius tutor. "Well, that's good." She walked back towards him, a giant plate piled high in her hands. "Because there is plenty here." She dumped them unceremoniously over their sprawled papers and grabbed a couple before collapsing down next to him. She bit into one and passed him the other, speaking around a mouthful. "I can't cook for my life, but my little brothers sure have some talent." Percy looked down at his cookie like it was Aphrodite herself. "I need to meet these brothers." Annabeth laughed, causing Percy's heart to trip over itself a couple hundred times. "They're actually pretty annoying most of the time. But I must say I did miss them when I wasn't living here last year." "How old?" he asked. "Turning 9, still kicking hard with the Lego, though. And the baking apparently." Percy coughed, choking on his breath. 9? I couldn't even boil water when I was 9. Annabeth looked over at him, a slight smile curling its way across her lips. "I imagine you were still burning water when you were 9, Percy." Percy opened his mouth. "Shut it again." Damn, she was right. "But that's okay," she continued, ignoring his pout. "I still burn water." She turned to him and grinned, and Percy threw the notion of just loving her out the window. Nope, he was going to marry this woman. He swore it. God of the sea? Ah. Poseidon. Correct. Goddess of the hunt? Artemis? Yes, good. Here's a cookie. Percy grinned triumphantly, catching the delicious sweet tossed at his head before lowering himself back down on the floor, his knees bent. Ancient Greek superstition of souls in vegetables? Percy pulled his upper body up in a sit-up, spouting his answer when he was face to face with Annabeth, who was sitting on his feet. Beans. They thought dead souls lived in beans. Thank the gods. Annabeth proclaimed, shoving his head back down when he came up again and throwing him another cookie. Who would have thought? Percy Jackson passes the test. You know, typically cookies and exercise aren't really associated together. Percy lay his arms above his head, sucking in a lungful of much-needed air. Neither is trivia and exercise, he laughed. You certainly are something, Percy Jackson, she mused, shifting off his feet to let him up. Better? He grinned. Much. Percy had left his first Saturday with Annabeth with a headache even cookies couldn't cure, and had returned the next week in absolute dread only to open the door to an Annabeth with a beam on her face and runners on her feet. Exercise, she had said, might help to focus your mind. Percy had pouted when she had taken off running down the block, prompting him to jog after her, but he couldn't deny the genius of her plan. Percy's mind had never felt clearer, and with her constant monologues of the rise and fall of civilizations and mythology systems, he had found himself listening and actually retaining some of the information. It was official. Annabeth was magic. There was no other explanation. Well, I think you'll at least pass your next assessment. She looked over at him, rolling her eyes when he just gave her a lazy thumbs up, too puffed to sit up and face her. Percy thought his lungs might explode. Or possibly implode. He still hadn't figured out which would be more painful. I haven't exercised that much since. He paused, taking a few deep breaths to calm his thundering heart rate, since high school. No. Middle school. When P was compulsory. Gods, I hated P. Annabeth's laugh tinkled in his ears and he rolled over slightly so he could see her better. Nothing could beat the sight of Annabeth Chase laughing, and he maybe sighed like an utter doofus in love. Because he was. Not that he would ever tell her that. It doesn't look like that was the last time you worked out. Her eyes drifted over his frame pointedly and Percy felt a blush flood his cheeks and neck. Gods, please let her think that it's just exhaustion and not mortal embarrassment. He coughed awkwardly, trying and mostly likely failing to pull off a confident grin. Oh, I was just Born like this, he trailed off. Annabeth's shoulders shook in amusement, her head tilted slightly. I'm sure. And maybe I swim a little. A little? A lot. I see. Her amusement was palpable in the air, and Percy wanted to bury himself under 10 feet of concrete. Very heavy concrete. The ocean's nice, he blurted, cursing his idiot head and non-existent filter. Seaweed brain, she murmured thoughtfully. Percy just looked at her dumbly. He could have sworn she had just called him seaweed brain, but this was Annabeth, so who even knew? Huh? Nothing, she laughed, chucking him another cookie. Percy wasn't glowing. He absolutely was not. He was lying on his back in Annabeth's lounge room, surrounded by Lego, the screams and thrilled shouts of her younger brothers who he still had never seen. He swore, if they weren't making such a racket he might have thought they were ghosts, playing video games upstairs floating throughout the mansion. Annabeth's subtle lemon scented him floating on cloud 9 as his tutor tossed him another heavenly cookie. Good work, seaweed brain. You might even top the class this year. Percy scoffed, grinning up at Annabeth. I'd have to beat you, first. Annabeth smirked. I retract my earlier statement. You'll be second. She shrieked when he jabbed her in the side, forcing her to roll over next to him. Only because I have the best tutor in the world, he laughed. They stared at the ceiling, lost in thought with goofy grins on their faces. Well, at least Percy had a goofy grin. So maybe he was glowing. Just a little. What are you doing for Christmas, wise girl? He whispered. Annabeth sighed lightly, turning her head to look at him. Just hanging around here. Mum and Dad actually come home for Christmas. The only time all year it seems that they're in the same room. Her voice had a bitter twinge of sadness, and Percy wished he could take it away. It's just me and my mum for Christmas. If you wanna drop by, he offered, gulping loudly. Annabeth smiled sweetly, catching his nervous eyes. I'll see if I can get away for a bit. Annabeth didn't show up to Christmas, but Percy didn't have time to sulk. It was his favorite holiday, after all. Besides, the next day back at uni a note sticky taped to his history desk caught his eye. Seaweed brain. Wish I could have been there. Percy smiled like an idiot all the way home. Mum. Percy called, crashing into their small apartment. You home? In here, sweetie. His mother's voice called from the kitchen. Percy grinned, sprinting down the small hallway and sliding on the tiles. Hey, Mum, he breathed, pulling her close into a giant bear hug. How was your day? Sally clutched him back tightly, though she was dwarfed by his tall frame. It was fine. He heard the slight tremor in her voice and peeled himself back to look her in the eye. No, it wasn't, he observed, smoothing a crease in her brow with his finger. His mother sighed, leaning into his palm. My boy, she smiled. When did you get so perceptive? He let out a short laugh. With you, my queen, it's second nature. Sally slapped him across the head good-naturedly. You certainly have your father's charms down pat. Percy frowned. He didn't want to be anything like that bastard. I'm not like him, he muttered defiantly. In every good way, you are, she smiled gently up at him. Your father wasn't all bad, sweetie. He was just selfish. Troubled. Percy heaved a sigh, pulling her close again. Whatever he was, he hardly cared enough to stick around. Sally rubbed his back in large circles, but didn't comment. Percy leant into the warm comfort of her touch, worry nagging at the corners of his mind. Mum? What happened today? Looks like I'm going to have to find a new job. Percy drew back, looking into her sad eyes. What? His mother scrubbed a stray tear away from her face, grinning wobbly. They sold the shop. Percy paused, taking in her words. The shop. The sweet shop. The sweet shop that Sally had worked at for the past decade and a half. They can't just fire you. Percy, it's not up to them, she smiled gently, grabbing his chin and forcing his angry gaze to hers. It's up to the new owners, and they just want a fresh team, I guess. Her eyes glossed over further, her words a breathy mumble. "I'm so sorry, Percy. I know you need to be studying, not worrying about us." "Hey, it's all right. I can work extra shifts," he insisted, mentally running through his timetable and listing things he might need to sacrifice. "You can't take care of me forever, Percy. But thank you. We'll just have to go a bit light on for a while." She reached up and smoothed back his hair. "I'm so sorry," her eyebrows crumpled. "No," he stated, holding her tighter. "Don't be sorry. We're gonna be fine." His eyes glanced over to the unopened bills on the island bench, thinking of the money he had set aside to pay Annabeth for this week, as he had done every week for the past month and a bit. "We'll be fine." He closed his eyes, cringing. "I'm sorry, Annabeth. Seaweed brain. Coffee is pretty good payment, too." Percy stared dumbfounded at the note that Annabeth had slipped onto his desk after their lecture had finished. He still hadn't moved, prompting his professor to look at him oddly before muttering under his breath and rifling through some papers at his cluttered desk. Percy thought he might cry, and no, that was not something he usually did. But here was Annabeth freaking Chase offering to tutor him for coffee. He had officially died. He was sure of it. Last Saturday he had turned to face her after their weekly session and relayed that he was sorry, not that he was sure she would really care, but that he didn't have enough money to keep on paying for a tutor. He had bit his lip, eyes on his shuffling shoes, feeling like the most inadequate human being on the planet as he thanked her for her amazing work and effort over the past month and a half she had put in, and for all the assignments that he had actually passed for the first time in his life, and, well, everything. But all good things had to come to an end eventually, right? Percy glanced down at the note again. Or maybe they didn't. He slammed his head against the desk. Oh, who was he kidding? He couldn't ask her to tutor him for coffee. That was absolutely absurd, and even he knew that it was a dick move. It was far less than she deserved. He sighed, defeated, fishing out his phone from his pocket. He hit Annabeth's number, her name only secondary to Mum and Donkey Hooves. Grover still hadn't forgiven him for that. "Percy?" Annabeth's voice was slightly crackled through the speaker. "Hey wise girl. Look. Seaweed brain, if this is about the coffee deal." "Yeah." He wiped his shaking hands on his jeans absent-mindedly. "It is, actually. It's super generous of you and all, but I really can't ask." "Great. I'll see you Saturday, then. Remember the coffee. You to do that for me." But she had already hung up. Damn stubborn. He ran his hand through his unruly hair, tossing his phone into his backpack. Percy turned up on Saturday. With coffee. Flat white, just how she liked it. Gods, he was a sap. The door swung open to reveal Annabeth in all her glory, her eyes widening and a grin spreading when she caught sight of the takeout cup in his hand. "You came," she said softly, accepting the cup as he awkwardly handed it to her. He shoved his hands deep into his jean pockets, rocking slightly back and forth on his heels. "Yeah," he breathed. She smiled up at him, stepping to the side. "Well, don't just stand there, come on." She stopped abruptly, blinking at his chosen outfit of jeans and a worn hoodie. Definitely not workout material. "No shorts?" Her voice had gotten quieter. "We trying a new learning technique?" Percy rubbed the back of his neck, his teeth catching his lip anxiously. No," he sighed, lifting his head to look her in the eye. His heart was beating ludicrously fast, and he wasn't sure how much of it was from her catching gaze and how much from the slightly confused, slightly lost expression slowly creeping across her features. Percy gulped. "Are you okay?" she asked, putting the back of her hand on his forehead and pulling it back quickly. "You're not sick or anything, are you?" Percy coughed slightly, shaking his head. No, nothing like that." Annabeth nodded slowly. "Oh, okay. Sue? I can't ask I out a dotis Annabeth," he rushed out in a breath, merging the words together. "Pardon?" She laughed weakly. A little slower this time. He took a deep breath, leaning his side against the door frame. "I'm sorry, Annabeth. But I can't ask you to do this for me. Her head shrunk back a little, her expression becoming wary. Do what? She tried to force a smile. Help me out. For nothing. It's not fair on you. She scoffed weakly. It's not nothing, seaweed brain. You got me coffee. Percy sighed heavily, scuffing his shoes. You know what I mean, Annabeth. No, she shook her head, drawing in a breath. I actually don't know what you mean. I'm your tutor. It's my job to help you out. Not when I can't pay for it, it's not. Annabeth rolled her eyes, but Percy cut her off before she could open her mouth. I'm sorry, wise girl, he looked back down to the ground again. I just can't ask you to do that. Annabeth opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but then slammed it shut again. She looked over his shoulder out to the road, her gaze turning slightly distant. Well then, as your friend, it's my job, she whispered. Percy smiled at her gratefully. I really do appreciate it, Annabeth. But I want to be able to pay you for your work. You put in so much effort and... because I want to. I don't need the money, Percy. She waved her hand around behind her, showcasing her spotless mansion. Percy swallowed, a slightly bitter taste erupting in his mouth. Of course she didn't need the money. Who was he kidding? I'm not a charity case, either, Annabeth, he said softly. I never said that. Her eyes looked panicked, offended, but Percy was too deep in disbelief to register it. You didn't need to say it, Annabeth. He forced a small, understanding smile, spinning on his scuffed heel and taking off down her pathway. Percy. She called after his back. Please. You're not. I promise. He sighed, looking at her over his shoulder. A small blonde girl, an angel, dwarfed by a castle. I know exactly how you meant it. He gave her a small self-depreciating smile, pulling his bike upright and pedaling off down the road. He never drove. Not anymore. Annabeth was an angel. And there was no way he would let her slave for him. Seaweed brain. You're an idiot. Percy crumpled the paper in his hand before realizing what he had done and frantically smoothing it back out on the tabletop. You are so whipped, Grover noted from beside him. Percy glared at his best friend, folding the note up gently and putting it on his wallet. I'm not, he sulked. Why don't you just, I don't know, ask her out? Oh, right. Like how you asked Juniper out? Grover blushed to his toes, running an awkward hand through his brown curls. That was different and you know it. Oh, Juniper. Percy mocked in a dreamy voice. Did you want to go plant a tree with me? Shut up. Grover hissed, elbowing him in the ribs. It was a perfectly good date idea. Don't worry, man, Percy laughed, pulling his pout on his friend's face into a wry smile with his thumbs. I'm sure she'll come around. Grover huffed. At least I had the nerve to ask. Percy went quiet. He knew Grover was right, he was being a coward. But it wasn't exactly easy to just walk up to an angel and ask them to dinner. It especially wasn't easy for someone like him, a charity case. She thinks I'm an idiot, he sighed, recalling the note that had been taped to his desk that morning. An idiot for not asking her out, Grover smirked. Shut up, dude. An idiot because I'm an idiot. End of story. Percy sunk lower into his booth, eyeing the coffee in front of him with distaste. I was her student, that's all. Percy, Grover implored. I think you actually might be stupid. What? Why? Because you're just coming up with excuses, Grover crossed his arms. She leaves you freaking daily notes, she talks to you on the way to lectures, you weren't just her student, you moron. Percy sighed. Well, what if she said yes? Then what? I can't even afford to take her on a date at the moment. Percy, you know she doesn't care about money. Only 'cause she lives in it, he sighed. I'm sure she'd miss it if it wasn't there anymore. Don't you think that's a bit unfair? It's a date. Not a marriage proposal. Percy's heart sunk, because, truth was, taking Annabeth on one date just wasn't going to cut it for him. He wanted to take her out on thousands and yeah, Hopefully marriage would logically be in the equation if it went well. So what if he was getting a lot ahead of himself? Sue me for wanting something better for her, he muttered. My gods, Percy. This is ridiculous. And why the hell are you drinking coffee? You hate coffee. Annabeth likes it. Percy shut his eyes, leaning his head back against the back of the booth. I know. It's disgusting. You are so hippo, my gods. Percy opened his eyes to see Grover's face split into a shit-eating grin. What? He asked cautiously. Here's your chance. She's here. Grover looked like he might die of excitement whilst Percy felt like he wanted to die for real. Oh gods, not again. He slipped under the table, curling himself up as small as he could. Grover kicked him sharply in the shoulder. Dude. Don't hide, for God's sakes. It's your future wife. I swear to all the gods, if you do not shut the hell up right now, so help me I will. Do you always make a habit of buying 2 drinks for yourself? Annabeth's voice cut through. Damn. Grover bleated nervously. Yeah. I get thirsty. Annabeth laughed, a beautiful sound Percy knew like the back of his hand by now. Can I? Do you mind if I sit? Don't you dare let her. Actually, I was just getting up. To. Grover paused. To get Percy. He is waiting for me. Outside. Grover, you're a dead man. Oh, awesome. I'll just take your spot then. Say hi to him for me. Shit. Shit. No. Grover yelped, banging his hands down onto the tabletop. I'll be back. Percy and I will be back. Soon? Oh, is it alright if I wait here for you? I'd love to speak to him, he's always so busy and all. Grover's voice squeaked. You know what? They have this magnificent cake display at the moment. Why don't we pick one and then I'll go get him? Percy face-palmed. Sure. She sounded mildly confused and Percy could picture a crease forming between her perfect eyebrows. Sounds good. Good. Grover exclaimed. Food. Gotta love. Good. Food. He got up from his booth, kicking Percy meaningfully as he stood. Percy scrunched his eyes shut, wanting to ignore his clear message of get the hell out from under the table. I hate you so much right now, Grover. Tucking his head under the drooping tablecloth, he watched Annabeth's graceful gait and Grover's slight limp across the floorboards towards the cake display. He sighed heavily, crawling out from under the table and slipping towards the front door, ignoring the startled stares of the other customers and trusting Grover to keep Annabeth occupied enough to prevent her casting her eyes around. He threw his weight against the glass door, its bell tinkling as he strode out into the crisp air. He flicked the collar of his jacket up, burying his hands in his pockets a little deeper. It was nearing the middle of winter, and the foreboding cold of snow was in the air. He leant his back against the facade of the small cafe, watching cars slip back and forth across the icy roads. Did Annabeth drive? He'd have to ask her later. Ask her to be extra careful. He shook his head at himself angrily. What are you doing, Jackson? She never asked you to care about her. A bright tinkle broke into his thoughts and there in front of him stood Annabeth Chase, a polite yet warning look on her face. Good morning, Percy. So nice of you to finally grace me with your presence. Percy cringed. He thought it might be an understatement to note that she looked royally pissed off. He shuffled his holy converse. Hey, Anna, he mumbled awkwardly. Annabeth wouldn't let him drop her gaze, and she stared at him expectantly. So, are you going to come in and sit with Grover, or are you going to hide under the table again? Her smile was sweet, but Percy gulped. He sighed, dropping his head and watching the white fog cloud from his breath. Stupid. Just come inside, Percy. I promise I won't kill you. Was he hallucinating, or did he detect an ounce of amusement in her tone? He jolted his head back up to meet her stare. He must be dreaming. There was the telltale glint in her left eye, the one that said she was battling not to laugh. He would know that expression anywhere, it was one of his favorites. He coughed, rubbing his hand over the back of his head. Right. He paused, chewing his lip, before pushing off the wall and slipping past her back into the cafe. Seaweed brain, he heard Annabeth mutter from behind him. He hoped it was fondly, but then again, he had always been a dreamer. He had her number. Percy Jackson had Annabeth Chase's number. Of course, he had always had her number, but that was different. That was business. This was more. Annabeth had left the cafe after devouring 2 cups of coffee with him and Grover, one that she ordered for herself and then the one that Percy hadn't even touched. Percy told himself it must have just been precognition that made him buy the disgusting beverage, and most definitely not a need to attempt to like the things that she did. Yeah, that's right. Precognition. It had only been when he and Grover were packing up to leave, Percy looking for his bike chain key in his backpack, when he had spotted the crisp white paper that screamed Annabeth Chase. He knew the paper off by heart, its texture, its color, its edging. The same paper she used to leave him his daily notes. And no, he had not spent hours poring over each single sentenced note. That would be stalkerish, and he was not a stalker. He hoped. Gods, maybe he was. He really needed to see a shrink or something. Maybe a doctor. First, all the tightening in his chest, then stalkerish motives and obsessions. He was sick. So sick. Ignoring his runaway thoughts over his own well-being, he had plucked the card from his bag and unfolded it, seeing 10 numbers printed neatly on the page with the words "This contact's not just for tutoring," seaweed brain underneath it. And now, lying on his bed in his small room, listening to the howling of the wind outside as a storm picked up, he was changing Annabeth Chase Tutor's contact name to Wise Girl. Nothing had ever looked so right in his phone before. He stared at the name for another 10 minutes dumbly, not quite believing his luck, before finally tying out a text. Hi, Percy? That's me, ha. Yeah, I know, you moron. How's life? Lifey. Oh. Good. How's yours? Never better. Percy thought he might die. Was it possible to die of sheer monotonous boredom? It must have been. Because he was dying. He was sure. That'll be 27.50, thanks, he sighed, bagging up the old lady's groceries and placing them in her little walking basket. It was a Saturday. And he was working. How had his life come to this? His mind flashed back to his mother's glossy eyes, the growing pile of unopened, unpaid-for bills towering on the kitchen table. He suddenly felt like he wanted to throw up. At least he had a job. Stupid. Forcing a bright smile onto his face, he accepted the lady's cash and gave her back her change, wishing her to have a beautiful day. As she hobbled out of the supermarket, Percy thought that there was nothing worse than being a regular checkout chick, but money was money and his other job at the pool couldn't give him any extra hours. So checkout chick it was. He looked around the harshly lit supermarket, the smallest one in town. And the least busy. The aisles were near empty, the crackling speakers blurting out advertisements and songs from some forgotten radio channel that hadn't been changed since the 70s, ever since they had forgotten where the radio was plugged in. How did one forget where a radio was? Percy had figured it was better just not to ask. 2 kids sprinted up to his register, their arms full of soft drink and lollies. "These, please," one with a brown mop of hair said gleefully. The other one, a smaller, skinnier boy with a shock of blonde curls, glared at his friend. "Hey, that was my line." "Well, I said it first, Matthew," the other boy humphed. "No fair, Bobby. You always say it first," he sulked. Percy paused, the names Matthew and Bobby ringing in his mind. He shook his head to clear it and laughed, ringing through their collection. "That'll be 1060, guys." Matthew and Bobby's eyes both snapped to his, despair on their faces. "I only have 250, Bobby whispered. "I only have 3, Matthew's bottom lip was trembling. Percy sighed. They couldn't have been older than 10, and he wondered idly if their parents were around. He looked back at their pile of sugar, then back at the register computer. $10.60 glared back at him. My mistake, boys. Sorry, I meant to say $5.50. He grinned at the kids, hoping his boss wouldn't castrate him for this. 3 plus 2. We have enough. Bobby shouted, jumping up and down on the spot. He snatched Matthew's $3 from his hand, joining it with his own money before dumping it in on the counter. Matthew's face slowly broke into a wide smile. Percy felt his heart melt. Maybe it was those grey eyes that stared thankfully at him, eyes that he may or may not have a weakness for. Have fun, boys, he smiled. Thank you. Bobby scooped up half the goods and sprinted for the doors, leaving Matthew to carefully pick up the remaining bags. Thank you, Percy, Matthew whispered, looking him straight in the eye. Percy startled, he had forgotten that he had a name badge on. For what? He laughed nervously. The kid's gaze was so eerily like someone else's he knew. The boy nodded his head towards Percy's screen, where $10.60 was still blinking loud and proud. Matthew smiled softly at him before walking quickly out of the store after Bobby. Percy looked on in amazement, shaking his head slowly. His heart felt soft and warm and he rubbed his chest in an effort to stop it from completely melting out of his body. He pulled a $5 note and a 10-cent piece from his wallet in his back pocket, slipping it into the till. His day suddenly didn't seem so bad anymore. Hey Annabeth. These crazy kids came into the store today. They were so adorable and my gods their eyes were almost identical to us. It was so creepy. Ha ha ha, that sounds so cute. Good to hear you had a great day. Yeah, I did. Would have preferred to be studying with you too. You still can, seaweed brain. Annabeth. You know I can't ask you to do that. So stubborn. Sorry. I'm just kidding with you. But you are still the most stubborn person I have ever met. Who, me? Never, ha ha ha. You just keep telling yourself that, seaweed brain. I cannot believe them. Percy looked up from his blue Coke. He had insisted that the cafe learn how to make his favorite all-time drink, to see Annabeth glaring at her phone. Percy was glad he wasn't her phone right now, and he half expected it to burst into flames. Or simply disappear into a black hole. Can't believe what? He asked. Her eyes shot to his, immediately softening a little. Nothing, Percy. It's nothing. Ball, he called her out, placing his hand out so she could pass him her phone. Seriously, Percy, she forced a laugh. It's nothing you have to worry about. Percy pouted, pulling his hand back. If someone was annoying you, you'd tell me, right? Annabeth smiled warmly at him and Percy thought that his brain might have just decided to disintegrate. You're annoying, Percy, she laughed for real this time and Percy felt his heart thump in his chest. He held a hand to his chest as though wounded, tossing his head to the side dramatically. You take that back, wise girl. She tilted her head back to rest on the back of the booth, her shoulders shaking with compressed giggles. No way. You love it, he stated, wiggling his eyebrows. Annabeth coughed a gasp, kicking his leg under the table. Yes, Percy, she said dryly. I just love that my best friend is so gods annoying. Percy's heart lit up and he's certain his face did too. I'm your best friend? He asked dumbly, holding his breath. Percy looked at him like he had just arrived from Mars. Did you hear any of what I just said? She rolled her eyes. How your god's annoying. Percy shook his head, grinning. Nope. I just caught the best friend's bit. He kicked her back under the table, poking his tongue out at her. Annabeth shook her head in what Percy hoped was a fond way. You're impossible, Percy Jackson. And proud, he beamed. She took a sip of her coffee, eyeing Percy's blue concoction warily. Is there ice in that? She wondered. Of course, he replied. Blue Coke is not blue Coke without the ice. It's like 0 degrees outside, crazy man, she chuckled. So? He blinked. We're inside. Annabeth groaned, leaning her head in her hands, shaking it in disbelief. "Only you," she mumbled. A tinkling bell, a noof and a sorry Mississippi, indicated the stumbling arrival of Grover. "Hey guys." He beamed, his eyes darting around their table, no doubt looking for food. Percy rolled his eyes at his friend's antics, pushing his half-eaten cookie towards him. "Here," he offered. "They're not as good as Annabeth's brother's ones anyway." A grin ate Grover's face as he brought the yo-yo to his nose, breathing in the sweet butter. "Thanks bro," he mumbled, his mouth already full with crumbs dropping to his chin. Annabeth laughed. "It's not just going to disappear on you, Grover." Grover looked up at her with comical seriousness. "How do you know that, though?" Annabeth looked over at Percy, exasperated, but Percy only shrugged and grinned. "He's got a point. Never know when an alien'll just pluck a cookie from someone's hands." Annabeth collapsed back in her booth. "I am surrounded by idiots." Percy grinned. Then frowned. "Idiots?" He pouted at Annabeth, seeing her flip her phone in her hand absent-mindedly, her eyes scrunched in disgust and amusement as she watched Grover devour his food. "Best friend." His frown disappeared. "Hey Annabeth. Annabeth. Wise girl. We're sea girl." "Yes, Percy. Are you okay?" Yeah? You sure?" "Yes, Percy. 100%. Not lying to me, are you?" "Of course not. Why wouldn't I be okay?" "No reason. Just a feeling. Sorry." "Hey, you've got nothing to worry about. Honest." "Thanks though." "Anytime, wise girl." Percy couldn't shake the feeling. He had tried everything. Breathing exercises, actual exercise, eating his mum's blue cookies, watching movies with his mum, drowning himself in everything that was comforting about Sally Jackson, pounding his head against the plasterboard, writing poetry, texting Annabeth, eating more food. Nothing was working. Nothing was stopping the dark curls of foreboding from clouding his mind. Like a storm that was brewing over the shore, his mind was being hit by waves upon waves of turbulent spirals. And he had no idea why. It was mostly a feeling, partly a voice. As though he could stop for a second and listen to the stillness and it would be telling him wait. Wait. Wait for what? Percy thought he might be going mad. But then he thought maybe he wasn't. He had felt this before, but he wished he didn't remember it. It had been back a few years when his half-brother, Tyson, had come crashing into his life. For a short while. Before. Percy scrunched his eyes shut, hoping against hope that this feeling didn't mean the same thing. It couldn't. But, do you hear that? Listen. Percy was lost in thought. His mind had been swimming in black thunderclouds for the past week and he was no closer to figuring out why. His eyes strayed unseeingly over the cafe tablecloth, counting the patched squares automatically, due on the 16th. Annabeth's voice rushed into his consciousness and he snapped his head up to meet her eyes. He looked at her with no comprehension, lost. "Percy?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Were you listening?" "The 16th, he mumbled, gulping. "Not already." "No. Yeah, that massive assignment for history is due then. It's only a couple days away. Are you still going to be stubborn about letting me help you?" "The 16th. 16th. Gods no." "Percy?" He tried to respond but found he couldn't. Instead, he could only catch his head in his hands as it fell towards the table. The waves were stirring, twirling, catching up in a cyclone. "Percy." She was next to him, crouched on the ground by his booth. Her hand was warm on his knee, on his back. He dragged in a deep breath of coffee-stained air. "Annabeth. Listen." He blinked, shaking his head slightly as she caught his eyes. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Just a bit out of it today." Annabeth sighed in relief, her shoulders sagging a little, but a crease was still etched between her brows. "What's going on with you? Tell me," she whispered, staying crouched beside him so they could talk quietly in the bustling cafe. He shook his head, releasing a lungful of air. "It's nothing," he promised. "Just a feeling." The 16th. At least now he knew what the feeling was from. He shut his eyes tight, pinching his lips together and scrubbing his face with his hands. Just a memory, he corrected himself. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly, her hand rubbing gentle circles into his back. He stood, dislodging her hold on him, and eased from the booth. She stood to her feet, looking up at him with confused storming. "Listen. I have to go do something," he murmured, turning on his heel and making his way to the glass doors. "Percy!" Annabeth called from behind him. He looked over his shoulder, smiling gently, trying to reassure her that he was fine. Even though he thought that maybe he wasn't. "I just have to do something. I'll see you later." He forced a smile, waving slightly as he stepped out onto the frozen sidewalk. He let the cold air engulf him, relishing in the way it tore at his unruly hair, the way it cut through his threadbare jacket, the way it reminded him that he was alive and real. Because he wasn't always sure of that, these days. He began the long walk down the road, stopping at a small florist to pick up a small bouquet. Blue flowers. Forget-me-nots. People busted past him, always in a rush to get somewhere, to do something. Percy just walked. He bowed his head. Dragged his feet. "Listen, brother." He looked up as he rounded the corner, watching pale snowflakes dance down through dark grey tombstones. There were no birds out today. "I'm sorry, Tyson." Grover was the one to find him. Percy should have figured. It was like the dude had a Find Percy tracker embedded in his brain. He supposed he should be grateful for that. He was freezing his ass off, but he didn't move as Grover stepped up to the grave and took a seat in the snow beside him. Grover let out a sad sigh, silently passing him a warm paper cup. "It's hot chocolate," he reassured. Percy took it gratefully, letting the drink warm up his frozen palms. It was still snowing, and Percy was covered in a fine layer of white dust, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His eyes were locked on one name, carved in stone. Tyson Jackson. Tyson had adopted Sally's last name in preference to his father's when he had found them 3 years ago. His own mother had died and he had grown up through the foster system. That alone had made Percy want to hunt down Poseidon and put a fist through his nose. The fact that the poor kid was skittish and sensitive and helpless only made him want to exchange the fist for a bullet. "Brother, listen." Percy shook his head, trying to rid his mind of his haunting voice. His silent tears had long since frozen on his cheeks and his breath was coming out in shaky gasps. Storm swirling. Grover sat quietly beside him, close enough to offer some warmth, but far enough to respect Percy's need for space. "He loved you, you know," Grover finally said, interrupting the stillness. Percy gazed at his brother's grave. He knew. "But Ella's gonna be there." Tyson whined, clutching at his mother's leg. Percy smirked, leaning against the doorway to the kitchen and watching the show. "Tyson Jackson, no. Tonight is family night. You know that." Sally reprimanded him, bopping him lightly on the nose. "But Percy always gets out of family night," Tyson grumbled, scrunching his chubby face into a pout. Sally laughed, scooping him up in her arms and sitting him on the counter. "Tyson, baby," she hushed. "Percy's not getting out of it tonight." Percy cursed inwardly. Damn it. His friend Rachel had invited him to a party and he knew he hated parties, but this was his senior year. He had to attend at least one. "Actually, Mum," he interrupted nervously, fleeting away from her round blue eyes. "I have somewhere to be tonight." "Yes," Sally agreed. "The lounge room." Percy sighed, his eyes flitting to Tyson and then to his mum meaningfully. Sally pursed her lips, ruffling a hand through Tyson's brown curls and dropping a kiss to his head. "All right, Tyson. We'll talk about this later," she promised. Tyson grinned hopefully, sliding down from the counter and bounding past to grab onto Percy's waist. He placed her chin on Percy's chest, looking up into his eyes. "You'll let me go see Ella, won't you, Percy?" Percy looked down at his little brother in defeat. He could never say no to the kid. "I'll see what I can do," he whispered, smoothing a hand through his curls before shoving him gently towards the dining room. "Now, go watch TV or something," he chuckled. Sally crossed her arms, looking up at her eldest as Tyson ran to the couch. "And what grand reason do you have for skipping out tonight, Percy?" Percy grinned innocently, wrapping his mother's small frame into a warm hug. "Me? Oh. You know. Just a final chance to act like a senior before I'm plunked back down at the bottom of the food chain next year." "Was that a question or a statement, Percy?" Sally asked sternly, though Percy could tell he had won half the battle already. "A statement. Mum," he whispered into her hair, "I finish in 4 months. You don't want me doing this closer to end-of-year exams, do you?" Sally shook her head gently. "You're not setting a very good example for Tyson," she reprimanded lightly. Percy kissed her hairline, smiling brightly. "Ty deserves a night out, too. He's just starting to make some friends. I know he acts like a kid, but he's turning 12 this year. He's a big boy. You know I can't drop him there, and I'm not comfortable with him taking a taxi." Sally pulled back and crossed her arms, adamant that this was law. Percy nodded, reassuring her. "I'll drop him on my way, and pick him up on the way back. I promise. And I won't drink." Sally looked at him shrewdly. "You'd better not." "Mum. Mum." Tyson called from the lounge room, his young voice shrilling in excitement. "I can hear them. I can hear the birds." "There are no birds out at night, doofus," Percy shot back fondly. Tyson appeared in the kitchen doorway, chubby fists planted on his hips, his eyes wide and shining. "But I did," he insisted. "I heard them." His little brother had always had a mild fascination with birds. He loved their song first thing in the morning, and would get up without fail every day since the day he had arrived on their doorstep to greet the sunrise alongside them. "Since when do birds come out at sunset, little man?" Percy laughed, ruffling his brother's hair. Tyson just grinned knowingly. "You'd hear them too if you listened." Percy hoped the feeling would wash away on the 16th. It didn't. If anything, it had gotten worse. He stumbled through the masses of students, pushing through the lecture door and dumping his barely finished assignment on Professor Brunner's desk. "Good morning, Percy," the professor exclaimed, smiling brightly through his beard. "Morning," Percy grumbled, stumbling towards the stairs and up to the back of the lecture hall. He collapsed in a desk, briefly looking around for blonde curls before pulling his beanie over his eyes and resting back in his chair. He had stayed up the whole night finishing the stupid assignment, and his stupid pride had said that he not ask Annabeth for help, despite the fact that he knew she had it finished her own weeks ago. Now he was cursing his stupidity. Maybe he could have spared some cash to pay her to tutor him through it. Not get a coffee for a couple days or something. No. That was Annabeth's coffee. Non-negotiable. But some extra cash, maybe. He had managed to pay off all the bills this month, and as long as his mum had some good food to eat, he didn't mind living off cheap crap for a few weeks. But then he thought of Annabeth's offended face when he accused her of him being a charity case. No, he wouldn't let her slave for him. But there was also no way that Annabeth would let Percy pay her another $1 for her troubles. That was just the way she was. And Percy loved it. Even though it frustrated the Hades out of him. Someone plucked his beanie from his face, and he groaned as bright light poured into his vision. "Annabeth," he mumbled tiredly, his hands batting around blindly to find her. "Gimme my beanie back." "You should have called me, Jackson," she reprimanded. "You won't let me pay you." He groaned again, slapping his hands over his eyes to escape the assaulting light. "You bet your foot, I won't. I don't need your money, seaweed brain. I want to help." He blinked at her through the gaps in his fingers. "And I want to pay you for your trouble. I'm not charity." Annabeth glared at him and he quickly shut his fingers again to avoid it. "You aren't charity, Percy. You're my friend." He thought he detected a tremor of hurt in her voice and he cursed himself to the high heavens. Dragging his hands off his face, he slowly met her eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry. You're my friend, too." she huffed, crossing her arms and glaring at a spot right over his left shoulder. "I sure hope so." Percy let a small smile slip, reaching out to grab one of her hands so he could swing it up and down. "Don't pout, Annabeth. I'll buy you 2 coffees. Annabeth met his eyes. "You always buy me 2 coffees, Percy. You never drink your own." "I hate coffee." Oh gods. Did that just slip out of his mouth? "You hate coffee?" Yes. Yes, it did. He shrugged noncommittedly, mumbling nonsensically under his breath. "Why in Athena's name do you always buy it, then?" Percy blushed. "No reason," he stuttered. Annabeth looked at him with a raised brow. "You are the strangest human I have ever met." Percy grinned weakly. "Thank you." She looked him over, a small frown taking over her face. "Are you all right?" Percy shrugged. "You mean, other than being entirely exhausted?" "I mean in general," she said, dead serious. "You've been off for days now." "Ever since." She sighed. "What did you have to do that day, Percy dropped his head, blinking down at his table. He didn't want Annabeth knowing this about him. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, it was just that he already felt inadequate. And he would prefer to keep the feeling to a bare minimum. "I just had to visit someone," he said flippantly, ignoring the lurch in his stomach, the burn rising behind his eyes. "Get a goddamn grip." "Oh," she whispered, not entirely convinced. "How were they?" "Dead." "Fine." He gulped, looking up to reverse the stinging. "You tell me if something was wrong, right?" Percy looked at her, feeling all kinds of guilty. "I'm what's wrong?" "Yeah. Course," he smiled weakly, turning back to the front. His front door creaked in resistance as he leant his weight against it, falling through into the hallway. He felt drunk. His mind was swimming, clouding his vision. Alcohol. Maybe that's what he needed. No. No. No more alcohol. Not ever. He kicked his shoes off, dragging himself to the entry to the lounge room. He sighed, leaning heavily against the wall at the sight. His mother was sitting on the worn couch, photo albums spread over the coffee table. Percy felt a tear build and fall over his cheek, his defenses finally having enough of keeping everything at bay. "Mum?" he croaked. Sally looked up at her son, his crumpling figure against the stained wall. She opened her arms silently and he went to them, surrounding himself in her scent of baked cookies and soap. "Mum," he whispered, feeling like something was jagged and broken in his chest. "SHH, sweetie," his mother soothed, running a comforting hand up and down his back. "You're okay." Percy shuddered, a sob choking up through his body and cracking from his lips. "But Ty isn't. Ty isn't." The music pumped through his veins in time to the cheap flashing lights. Percy immediately felt uncomfortable. Parties had never been his scene, but it was his last chance to just be a normal high school teenager, and goddamn it, he was going to enjoy himself. Or at least try. Bright red hair flashed in his vision and he turned to spot his best friend pushing her way through the masses of sweaty, dancing bodies until she was by his side. "You look so uncomfortable," she yelled above the music. "Loosen up." Percy rolled his eyes but smiled down at her fondly. "Don't pretend that you're any more comfortable than I am." Rachel laughed, shrugging her shoulders and taking a small sip from a bottle. "I must be a better actor than you, then. Come on." She grabbed his hand, hauling him straight into the mess of writhing bodies. Percy allowed himself to be dragged away, reluctantly accepting a bottle when it was pushed towards him. "Don't drink it." Rachel looped her arms over his shoulders, moving in a ridiculously dorky Rachel way to deafening racket. Percy's heart squeezed a little. Rachel and he had been best friends since kindergarten, and here they were, mere months away from graduating. "This is crazy." He spoke straight into her ear so she could hear him. "Why do people think this is fun?" Rachel threw her head back, giggling and shaking her head. "Because they're drunk idiots, my friend." She raised her bottle and tipped it towards Percy's own. Percy shook his head at her. "I promised Mum I'd pick Tyson up." Rachel smiled up at him gently. You're too good for your own good, Percy Jackson. Percy shrugged, blushing as someone ran into him from behind, pushing him slightly closer to her. Rachel looked up into his face, sticking her tongue out and scrunching her nose at his blush. You're so innocent, she smiled. Please never change. Percy started, wondering whether or not he should be offended. I am not innocent. Rachel cocked an eyebrow at him. Okay. Well, maybe. A little. A little? Rachel tapped her forehead against his chest, stifling laughter. I just need to be able to help out at home, you know? Rachel pulled away from him, grinning into his flustered face. And that's why you are the most precious person on the planet, my friend. Percy grumbled under his breath, scanning his eyes over the crowd. Oh shit. Hey, Rach, he stuttered. Luke just walked in. Rachel's face immediately brightened and she leant against his shoulder, raising herself to her tiptoes to get a better look over his shoulder. Percy tried to ignore that she was right there and gods, she smelt like paint and roses. Oh my gods. Oh my gods, oh my gods, oh my gods. Rachel started borderline hyperventilating. Rachel. Percy placed his hands down on her shoulders, drawing her stare to his. Calm down. He took a giant breath in, motioning for her to do the same. She sucked in a little air and released it in a rush. How do I look? She breathed. Beautiful. You look fine, honest. She grinned up at him, ruffling his hair slightly. You wouldn't mind if I. You know. No. No, of course. Go ahead. He pushed her slightly towards Luke's direction, mentally kicking himself in the balls. You idiot. Push her towards another guy, why don't you? You're sure you'll be okay? Percy knew that face. That was the maybe this wasn't such a good idea, I really shouldn't leave you to fend for yourself amongst the hyenas look. I will be fine, he promised. Go have fun. Rachel drew in a large gulp of air, rubbing her hands down the side of her jeans. Okay. Okay, I'm going to do this. Yep. Cool. Awesome. She gulped. I'll do it. Just go, Percy chuckled, catching her hands and looking straight into her eyes. He'd be an idiot to not want to talk to you. She gave him a grateful smile, squeezing his hands gently. Stay safe. Call me if you need me. I'm not going anywhere, okay? I'll be somewhere in this stupid mansion. Percy laughed, giving her a kiss on the forehead. You worry too much, Red. She looked at him wryly, squeezing his hands once more before letting go and walking with her worn-down, paint-splattered Converse towards the one and only Luke Castellan. You're a Class A idiot, you know that, Jackson? Percy slammed his fist against his forehead, turning it into an awkward thumbs up when Rachel checked back over her shoulder. Don't have too much fun. He yelled, forcing a grin. Rachel just rolled her eyes, a sweet smile on her lips. Wouldn't dream of it, dork. You look like shit. Why thank you kindly, wise girl, Percy mumbled. She shoved him in the side gently, making his swing spin in wide circles. Seriously, she implored, her grey storms nailing his own. What's going on? Percy sighed, wondering where to even start. Nothing. Annabeth pursed her lips. It's not uni, is it? Her eyebrows were furrowed and Percy knew she felt guilty about the whole charity thing. No, wise girl. I promise it has nothing to do with uni, or tutoring. Or you. What about money? She bit her lip, looking down at her bare feet as they trailed in the dirt under the swing set. Percy knew they must have been freezing, but she was stubborn, and if she had worn the stupid things all day, gods forbid she wear them even a second longer. You don't have to talk about it if you're not comfortable, but you work every afternoon at the pool, and then the other day the boys said they saw you at the supermarket as well and... Wait, what? Percy cut in, stuck on the boys and supermarket thing. Are their names Bobby and, Matthew by any chance? Annabeth eyed him strangely. Yes. You know this, seaweed brain. Oh. And he did. She was right. He distantly remembered a conversation regarding her ninja younger brothers who made the best cookies but never showed their faces. Percy thought he might have spent the whole conversation counting the freckles on her nose. Whoops. Ah. Yeah, he forced a chuckle. I was just kidding. I knew that. I was completely, absolutely, 100% listening to you. Yep. Annabeth laughed to the sky, shaking her head at him. What am I going to do with you, Jackson? Percy shrugged, leaning back to get his swing going. A deep churning feeling started in his stomach, but he ignored it. He must have eaten too much lunch before going on this impromptu trip to the local park. He had been insanely bored and his usual pastime of swimming just wasn't going to cut it this time. Not with his thoughts in a whirlwind. Not with the tense atmosphere at home. The same stifling guilt that upheaved for the same week every year for the past 3 years. Percy gazed over the car park towards where he knew the cemetery lay. There was no snow, but the air was frigid, and Percy's fingers felt frozen on the swing chains. You're awfully quiet today, Annabeth said gently, pushing the swing to keep up with him. Yeah, he whispered, feeling the telltale hot sting of tears behind his eyes. He glanced over at Annabeth, catching her worried look. He gave a small smile, taking in her blue beanie and massively oversized coat. You cold? She shook her head adamantly, her nose red and sniffly. Not at all, her teeth chattered. You're freezing, he stated. She shook her head again, laughing gently at him. I'm fine. Promise. Percy sighed, looking back over the car park. He should get her inside somewhere warm, but he also couldn't deny that it was nice just being quiet out in the cold on a child's playground. Listen, brother. Percy shut his eyes against the haunting image of Tyson's large brown eyes. Listen. Annabeth, he whispered. Annabeth hummed, turning her head slightly towards him. He stopped, choked. I had a brother. I had. Listen, brother. Do you hear that? An idea. He finished quietly, leaning his head against the cold chains. Yeah? And what is this most amazing, peculiar idea of the great and mighty Perseus Jackson? Percy breathed out a laugh. I bet I can swing higher than you. Do you hear that? His stomach was churning violently, but now he knew it wasn't from a lunch. Annabeth. I doubt it, seaweed brain. She took off, using her body as momentum to propel her back and forth on the old swing. Percy watched her. Watched her blonde curls flay behind her from underneath her beanie, watched her bare feet that must have been freezing kick into the open air, watched white fog stream from her lips as she laughed, yelling at him to get a damn move on, you idiot. Percy's stomach dipped. It felt like a giant black hole had just opened inside his gut. No. Do you feel that, big brother? Percy kicked off the ground, furiously lurching himself as high as he could, wishing that he could simply take off and fly away. Just fly away. Percy was going to punch Castellan's pretty little face in. He swore it. He felt sick, watching from his spot against a wall as Rachel and Luke chatted it up like they had known each other their whole lives. And the way she was looking at Luke. She never looked at Percy like that. Percy sighed, knocking his head back against the wall. Idiot. He glanced down at the bottle that was dangling from his fingertips. It was still full. Don't drink it. He thought the voice in his head sounded suspiciously like Rachel and suddenly he didn't care. She wanted to have fun? Sure. Well, so would he. He popped the cap and brought the drink to his lips. Don't drink it. He took a sip. A black hole opened in his gut, a swooping feeling that had nothing to do with the alcohol and everything to do with something's wrong. Yeah, something was wrong. Rachel was with Luke. He downed another gulp. Percy was going to hunt down the inventor of IKEA flat packs and kill them. Slowly. Go. In. You. Stupid. Box. He grunted, slamming a hammer down on the poor unsuspecting piece of laminate. Are you trying to kill it? Shut up, Annabeth. Annabeth laughed at his expense, sparing him a single glance before turning back to her episode of How I Met Your Mother. Percy had been complaining that he couldn't put together the cabinet that was obviously flawed for his mum's bedroom. Figures she would turn up at his door with a container full of cookies and a grin. "You could always let me try," Annabeth piped. Percy grumbled, reaching around for something heavier than a hammer to slam into the piece of furniture. "I hate you." Annabeth let out a breathy laugh, giggling slightly at his furious face. "If you say so. I say so." He stopped for a moment to look over at her, sprawled on his couch like she lived there. He shook his head, trying to remain grumpy but ultimately failing. "Damn you, Annabeth." He remembered the first time she had turned up at his apartment. He had been on his way to lifeguarding and had barged out of the door only to run straight over her. She had remarked that he looked cold in his state of shorts and shirtlessness in the middle of winter, and he had stammered and blushed until a quick bool heated had spluttered from his lips. To this day, not his proudest moment. He had worried slightly what she would think of his place, considering she lived in somewhat of a mansion, but she hadn't even blinked as she had breezed past him into his hall, calling out that she wanted to meet Sally, and that was that. Percy didn't think he'd ever wanted to kiss someone quite so much. He shook himself out of his reverie, twisting another screw into place. "Wrong screw," Annabeth called over without even sparing a glance. Percy huffed. "And how the hell would you know?" Annabeth smiled, pausing the TV and looking over at him. "I'm just assuming." "Ha ha," Percy deadpanned, glaring dryly at her. "Give me that." She motioned vaguely for the hammer. Percy threw a box full of stuffing at her instead. "XXX. Nearly. There. Just one more. Push. Come on. Fudge muffins. You didn't break it, did you?" "What do you mean I? Don't you mean we?" "No. I meant you. Wise girl." "Yes? Just give me the damn hammer." She passed him the hammer and he slammed it once more onto the mutilated cabinet. The boards shifted and aligned together with a soft click. "I mean, at least it kind of looks like the picture." Annabeth tilted her head to the side, biting her lip anxiously. Percy glared at the IKEA box and then at the haphazard cabinet. The resemblance was there, he supposed. He let out a short bark of a laugh, resting his hands on his hips and leaning forward, blowing his unruly black hair from his eyes. "I hope Sally doesn't mind the rustic look." Annabeth cringed, looking over all the dents before dissolving into hysterics. "Oh my gods, she's going to kill me." "Don't be stupid," Percy breathed in between chuckles. "She loves you." Annabeth stopped laughing for a second, looking at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "You really think so?" Percy smiled at her gently, pulling on a curl and letting it bounce back up to her shoulder. "I know so." A soft flush stained her cheeks and she looked away quickly, assessing their masterless piece. "I don't think it looks half bad." Percy fought down the growing trepidation building in his gut. It had become a constant battle, the voice of his brother echoing in his ears any time she was around. It was near deafening and he didn't quite know what to make of it. The last time he had felt something like this, maybe he was going crazy. "I think I'm going crazy," he whispered. She laughed, flopping back down onto the couch. "We're all crazy, Perce. Although you definitely went psycho-murderer on that poor cabinet. I'm still going to kill whoever invented that." "You do that, seaweed brain." Her laugh echoed around the small living room and for just a split second it eclipsed the festering dread in his stomach. "Listen. The road wasn't supposed to be fuzzy. Everyone knew that. Percy knew that. Yet it was. He was not drunk. He swore it. The white lines of the road blurred in his windscreen, the snow pelting at the glass. Have to pick up tie. Have to pick up tie." A swirl of dread needled its way through his body. He felt it in his toes, his fingertips, a spreading numbness that encompassed the cold surrounding him. He'd only had a sip. He was not drunk. "You're not drunk." The snow was coming down in sheets of ice, crashing into the windows like thunder. Percy sat bundled up in blankets on the coach, staring at the stained wall ahead of him. He remembered that stain, remembered the day that Tyson had decided that throwing spaghetti at the wall was a legitimate exercise even if it was already covered in tomato sauce. Now it stared at Percy like a lost thing, begging for notice, haunting his mind. Percy grabbed a pillow and threw it at the wall, wishing it would just disappear, wishing that everything to do with Tyson would just shut up and leave him alone. It wasn't fair of him, he knew. He deserved it. Every last string of guilt he deserved to hang around his neck like a noose. But that didn't make it any easier. A loud knock drew him from his mind, and he dragged himself from the couch, his stack of blankets trailing behind him. He opened the door to a popsicle Annabeth dripping in the apartment complex hallway. Gods, Annabeth. What the Hades happened to you? Annabeth frowned, crossing her arms over her chest and blowing a soaked piece of hair from her forehead. Nothing much exciting, she grumbled. Just let me the hell in. Percy stifled a laugh, stepping to the side to allow her in. She brushed past him, rubbing her arms in an attempt to keep warm. Percy chuckled softly, moving up to her and wrapping her in a bear hug with all his blankets. Why don't you take a seat and I'll go get you some dry clothes, huh? He asked, dumping his mountain of rugs onto her shoulders and slipping away down the hall. He went straight to his dresser, finding some smallish tracky pants and an old high school jumper. It'll have to do, he muttered, casting his eyes over his mess of a room. He figured he should probably clean that up. Or make sure Annabeth didn't step foot inside. Shrugging, he closed his bedroom door behind him, sliding on his fluffy socks back to the lounge room. Annabeth was bundled in blankets and shivering on the couch. She had pulled off her drenched beanie and her blonde curls were plastered to her head, making her face look smaller and paler than usual. Percy had the ridiculous urge to give her a cuddle and never let go. Knock it off, imbecile. Ah. Clothes? He offered, awkwardly shifting on his feet. Annabeth turned to him, a small, grateful smile lighting up her features. Thanks, she accepted. Bathroom? Percy looked at her, eloquently confused for a minute until she elaborated, I need to change. Oh. Yeah, I mean. Duh. Right? He laughed weakly, waving his arm in the general direction of the toilet. That way. She nodded her thanks and shuffled off, the mountain of blankets dwarfing her small frame. Percy huffed out a sigh, collapsing onto the couch and scrubbing his hands over his face. The wind was howling a racket outside and Percy wondered what was so drastic that she had made the trip to his house. The roads were surely slippery, and despite it being the middle of the day, it was dark as night. Did she drive here? Gods, he hoped not. But then again he also hoped she hadn't walked the whole way in the freezing cold. At least she was wearing shoes this time. Damn it, Annabeth, what are you doing to me? Seaweed brain? He jumped, swinging his head over the back of the couch. Hey, Anna. Come sit. He shuffled his butt over, making room for her. Sorry we don't have much room. It's usually just the two of us. The two of us. Mum, I mean. And me. Annabeth laughed lightly, snuggling into the old couch like it was a heater. I love it. So. He started awkwardly. What brings you trekking through the concrete and ice jungle today? Annabeth was silent, so he looked over at her, taking note of her bowed head and chewed lip. She shook her head mutely. Hey, he whispered. What's up? Snothing. She was barely mumbling, and suddenly even the torrential downpour pounding the windows seemed too loud. You're sure? Percy had just gotten a feeling. A feeling he had come to hate and dread and fear and run away screaming from. It never meant anything good. Listen. Annabeth nodded slightly, smiling weakly. Just wanted to see you, she shrugged. Percy cocked an eyebrow in suspicion. I'm flattered and all, but I really don't think that's the reason. Annabeth just shrugged, and Percy decided to drop it. Have you seen the new season of Suits? He asked instead. Annabeth breathed out a chuckle, throwing him the remote control. Not yet. Percy flicked the TV on and settled back to watch. The wall behind the screen taunted him. Listen, brother. Wait. Wait for what? He felt like screaming and tearing his hair out. Just leave me alone. He clamped his jaw shut, trying to focus on the people flittering across the TV. Annabeth relaxed beside him, her shivering letting up finally, and she curled deeper into the blankets. Percy stared at the screen. Stared at the wall. Brother. Their song. Hey Anna. Anna? Did you get home okay? Annabeth? She had gotten home okay, Percy found out. But Annabeth's parents were getting a divorce. He heard it from Grover, and wondered why she hadn't felt that she could tell him herself. Or why she would tell Grover before him. It was irrational, he knew. They were getting divorced, for God's sakes. This was not the time to be petty. But he couldn't help but notice the lack of a sticky note on his desk that morning. Or the morning after. The black hole in his gut expanded. Wise girl. You okay? I just want to be alone right now, Percy. I'm sorry. Right. Yeah, no, of course. He heard the lights before he saw them. To this day, he was still not sure how. He heard their pitched whines as they barreled down the road towards Ella's property. Heard the wail of the night as they split its darkness. Do you hear that? He could have sworn it was Ty's voice. But Tyson was inside, so it couldn't have been. He opened the door, stumbling out onto the road. The quiet night assaulted his brain, the pounding behind his eyes growing with each second. Shit. He was drunk. He couldn't drive Tyson like this. He wouldn't. And so he sat on the wet road, laying his back down to stare at the stars. Count stars, not sheep. He could hear giggling from inside, the sheer giddiness of youth and laughter echoing from the small house's walls. And he heard the lights. The deep-seated sense of numbness took him by surprise. He hadn't been drugged. And he wasn't that drunk. But he couldn't move. Listen. Can you hear that? He tilted his head to the side, saw the curb right next to his head. He should move up to the grass, just in case. But he couldn't bring himself to even lift a finger. A heavy weight was pressing on his chest. Drowning. Suffocating. The lights were closer. Percy. That was Tyson. He knew it was. Percy. He closed his eyes against the obtrusive yell. His brain couldn't take that right now. What was Tyson doing outside anyway? Hands were on his arms and legs, pulling him to the edge of the curb. A little body stood on the road, pushing him up to the grass. I'm fine, Ty, Percy slurred, shoving him away lethargically. Can you hear that? Tyson asked. Here you are. He scrunched his eyes shut. Yes, he could hear it. He could hear everything and anything, and he just wanted it to shut up. I don't know. It sounds like. Percy never found out what it sounded like. A pitched squeal of tires and metal crashed into the curb like a steam train. There was weightlessness, dizziness, and then blood stung Percy's eyes, clogged his throat, winded his lungs, and then his ears rung. The night creeped through the air and stifled the silence. Tyson? His voice was cracked, garbled. Tyson? He couldn't see. He couldn't move, he couldn't move, he couldn't. Tyson. The lights blared across the frozen street. He couldn't hear them anymore. Tyson's grave was glaring at him. Not really. But he wished it would. Then maybe he would feel better. Anger and guilt was roiling through him in hot waves, thrashing against his insides, coiling like a snake. Ty, the whisper fell from his lips, disappearing into the snow. Why are you in my head? Listen, brother. Listen to what? He yelled, throwing his voice across the deserted graveyard. Listen to what, Ty? The tears froze his eyes before he could even shed them. Shit, Tyson. Shit. Listen to what? He whimpered, falling to his knees beside the grave, leaning his head against the cool marble. Brother, do you hear them? Percy could hear lights. And it was psyching him the hell out. Annabeth was giving him radio silence. Grover looked awkward and kept mumbling about food and Juniper in his presence, and his mother had gone on a cooking binge to no doubt escape Tyson's haunting memory this time of year. But the lights. They were so familiar. It wasn't even a sound, not really. More a feeling. A tingling. An atmosphere that buzzed and tingled and filled his head just like it had on that night 3 years ago, and damn it, Percy never wanted to hear that sound again. Seaweed brain. I'm sorry for being a bitch. Annabeth's last note taunted him. She had left it yesterday. She hadn't turned up today. Her radio silence wall was still up with no indication of being brought down. She had ignored his texts, his calls, even his house visits. Her brothers had looked at him sadly and turned him away before he could even open his mouth. He wanted to know what the Hades was wrong. Or, even better, what the Hades he did wrong. The last time he had talked to her was when they watched Suits. Did she not like Suits? Maybe he should have asked. No, don't be stupid, Annabeth's not like that. Her parents got divorced. She wanted space, he could understand that. If his dad suddenly showed up, he probably would have locked himself in his room for a month. But even her brothers were still hanging around the supermarket, whilst Annabeth had been a no-show. And now she was skipping class. Which was so completely not Annabeth that it had him slightly hyperventilating on the inside. And now he could hear the lights and he thought he might just be crazy, but what if he wasn't and something awful was going to happen, because that feeling and the lights never left anything good in their wake. And Percy needed to see her. Now. XXX. Percy was not freaking out. He wasn't. His leg was just jittering and his fingers were just tapping on his bicycle handles because he had attention issues. It definitely wasn't because he was worried or anything. At all. He stepped from his bike, letting it fall to the crusty grass in Annabeth's front lawn. He climbed her front steps slowly, remembering the first time he had so long ago, anxious about letting a pretty girl tutor him. Now he was wondering if a pretty girl would even let him inside. He rested his fist against the wooden door, letting a rush of air escape his lungs. He knocked hollowly. Once. Twice. He stepped back, clenching and unclenching his hands against the cold. The click of footsteps echoed behind the door, rushing towards the front. Percy clasped his hands behind his back, bracing himself as the door inched open with silence. Two grey eyes peered at him suspiciously, tiredly. "Percy," she whispered. Percy sagged into himself, stepping forward and leaning against the gap in the door. "Anna." He stopped himself. Looked over her frame. Saw how her clothes seemed to hang from her body, saw how her eyes were rimmed in purple smudges, dark as bruises, saw how she fidgeted and shied away from the open door. From him. Percy felt his heart crack, oozing blood from his body. "Wise girl," he whispered gently. "Can I come inside?" Annabeth just stared up at him, small and shivering. "Please," he breathed. She didn't say anything, but she turned from the door, leaving the gap open. Percy took the invitation and slipped inside, instantly shivering beneath his coat at the frigid degrees. The house looked immaculate and cold, with no mess of papers or Lego to be seen. It looked wrong. "We're selling the house," Annabeth whispered from a couple of steps ahead of him. Her voice echoed off the empty walls. Percy blinked. That explained the emptiness. "Why? Dad's taking the boys to San Francisco. And you?" he asked quietly, as though not wanting to wake the ghosts in the walls. "I don't know yet." She gathered the edges of her hoodie and hiked it further up her shoulders. "I don't know what Mum wants." "Have you spoken to her?" Annabeth shook her head softly, still not facing him. "Not in weeks." She leaned a shoulder against the hallway as though her own weight was pressing down on her. "San Francisco," she mumbled absently. Percy breathed in. Breathed out. Went to step forward. Hesitated. Stepped back again. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, looking at her frame dwarfed in bundles of clothing and trying hard not to feel hurt. "I didn't want you to worry. You've been so out of it lately without my adding to it." Percy blinked. Gulped. "I know. I'm sorry. But I would have listened." She turned to face him, her face pale and washed out. "I know. I just needed to do this alone." Her eyes begged for him to understand, and he did. But he also didn't. I used to think I had to deal with everything alone, he started. And then stopped. Because that was exactly what he did, wasn't it? Ran away every time something happened. Every time he felt like he couldn't deal. He had run away from Rachel, from Tyson, his mother, Grover, Annabeth. It's hard not to, he finished, hanging his head. I know. She met his eyes glassily. I just need time to process. The boys are heading off tonight. Then the house. She took a deep breath. I just need to get settled again, get in control again. My mother. My mother. Her eyes flickered to the ceiling. I just need space. Percy looked at her, watched her eyes asking for him to leave, to not see her like this. To not see her fall apart. Her pride wouldn't let that happen, and something in Percy's heart ached because he wanted to be the one person who she could let her guard down to. That she wouldn't feel too proud for. But he wasn't, and he knew that. Of course, he said, nodding. He retreated in his steps, spinning on his heel slowly and trailing down the shiny hallway. He slipped out the door into the equally freezing outside air. He rubbed his arms in an effort to get some warmth back into them. Annabeth? He called back inside. Her face appeared around the corner of the open door. Put the heater on. Annabeth looked down and nodded. So timid. Why so timid? And Annabeth? Her gaze snapped to his. Eat something, wise girl. He gave her a small smile and trudged through the snow to where his bike lay discarded on the ground, ignoring the plummeting in his gut that expanded with every step from the house he took. Listen. The lights, brother. Percy stared up at the rolling storm clouds. Electricity crackled the air. It was bleak as night. The house behind him was dark. There were no lights. Percy was not pacing. He wasn't. He was simply exercising. In his room. By walking. Whilst tearing his hair out. Not pacing. At all. Posters of Olympic swimmers glared at him through their shiny goggles from his wall, their voices mimicking and echoing in his head. Calm down, calm down, calm down, calm down, calm. Something was very wrong. Percy could hear it. The most significant things happen in the quiet. Percy hated that. It was dark when he got the call. And silent. The lights had long since hushed their song, but Tyson's voice still beat a constant thrum behind his eyes. Listen, 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 listen. Percy curled up against the bedroom wall, shivering. His gut felt like a black hole, the swooping feeling encompassing his whole body. Get out of my head. He gritted his teeth until his jaw ached. Get out of my head. Listen, 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 listen. A buzz from his desk drew his attention, his blurry eyes noticing the phone screen light up. He scrambled to his feet, unsteadily stumbling toward the desk before snatching up his phone. Wise girl. With shaking hands he took the call, pressing it to his ear like she might disappear into smoke. Anna? Silence. Annabeth? His voice cracked, but he couldn't even find it in himself to be embarrassed anymore. Her end was full of static. The sound of lights. Anna? Crashed into a tree. He had found her. He still wasn't sure how. All he had heard was listen, 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 listen. And his bike tires had clawed through the thick snow, following his brother's voice. She had called just before passing out. Her car was flipped in the snow, her pale face streaked in blood. He couldn't even remember screaming. They had dragged him away as he fought, clinging on tight. They took her away in flashing lights. They wouldn't tell him if she would wake up again. Percy was not fidgeting. At all. He was simply jiggling his leg in anticipation of having more than watered-down caffeine for the first time in 24 hours. Here you go, sweetie, the nurse smiled gently, handing over a blanket and a soggy sandwich. It was all I could find. Percy nodded gratefully, watching as she checked Annabeth's vitals before leaving the room quietly. The machines beeped around him, but he couldn't bring himself to care because it meant that she was still breathing. That she was still alive. He unfolded the blanket and lay it on top of her other one, tucking it up as high as it could go without disturbing the multiple wires and lines protruding from her chest and arms. Purplish bruises smudged her face, her left arm completely crumpled and wrapped in a cast. Percy's gaze traveled to the flat spot under the blanket. He wasn't sure how he could tell her she didn't have a leg anymore. He felt numb. "She's alive, brother." Percy closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. She'd be okay. She had to be. He reached up, gently squeezing her hand, bringing his sandwich to his mouth with the other. It was soggy and tasteless, but he forced himself to down it anyway. He couldn't expect himself to stay awake if he had no energy. And there was no way he was falling asleep. Her dad had called earlier, saying he and the boys were hopping on the first flight back, but the snow had delayed all the flights to New York, and he wasn't sure when they could get in. He hadn't heard anything from her mother yet. Percy didn't even know where she was. "I'm so sorry, wise girl," he mumbled, gently twirling a blonde strand around his pinky. Not even Percy's mother could make him go home. Not now. The boys had shown up that morning, nearly 4 days after Annabeth had first been admitted. He still hadn't slept. Hence his mother's current unhappy stance in front of him. "Percy, you're no help to her if you make yourself sick." "I'm fine," he yawned, scratching his 4-day-old stubble. He should really invest in a razor. And maybe some soap. "Perseus Jackson, I will not have my son scaring away the nurses. Now give Annabeth some space." Her eyes softened and she ran a hand down his cheek. "I promise I'll call straight away if anything changes." Percy shook his head, adamant not to move. "I'm looking after Bobby and Matthew." Sally looked dubiously around the room, staring pointedly at the boys snoring on the couch opposite. She raised an eyebrow. "I appreciate your valiant effort, Percy, but I think they'll be fine." The boys, like Percy, hadn't left their sister's side since they had arrived, Bobby even going so far as to curl up carefully next to her on the bed, gently stroking her hair and singing old nursery rhymes. Percy had never missed Tyson so much than in that moment. Never grieved what had been taken from him, a child so young, as he did then. "I'm not going," he mumbled. His mother knelt down in front of him, taking his hands in her own. Her eyes were glistening in the fluorescent lights. "She's not Percy. She's going to be okay." Percy tried to believe her. He really did. He glanced over at her sleeping form. An hour couldn't hurt, he guessed. "Just call me if anything happens." Mothers always knew best. Percy could appreciate that as he wandered the hospital garden. He had needed this. He just hadn't known it. The sunlight filtered softly through bare branches and onto the icy ground, the frigid air cutting through to his bones, making him feel for the first time in days. He was sick of being numb. He tilted his head to the sky, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets. The world seemed so bright, so clean. And it felt so wrong because Annabeth was lying inside, pale as a ghost and hooked up to beeping machines. And the world keeps turning. Percy had a fleeting thought that that was unfair. The world should stop and weep for a while when someone as beautiful as Annabeth Chase stopped smiling. He exhaled heavily. Truth be told, she had stopped smiling long before the accident. He had noticed, he had just chosen to ignore it. What kind of friend did that make him? He would be flat out lying if he said he didn't notice the thin smiles, the faked laughter, the way her eyes dimmed when her mother was mentioned. Percy didn't know everything, but he knew enough. Knew enough to know that a family implosion invaded every aspect of your life. And there was no such thing as zero collateral damage. He should know. He caused it in his own family. He still couldn't look in the mirror without seeing a murderer. A monster. A sick brother who couldn't even save the one person who meant the most in the world to him. He closed his eyes. Opened them. Looked to the vast expanse of pale blue. When Annabeth looked at him she didn't see a murderer. But for how long? Now not only had he killed his brother, but he had nearly let her die too. He hadn't noticed. Hadn't stayed. Hadn't persisted to stay by her side when he knew, that something was wrong. What kind of person did that make him? Sighing wearily, he collapsed on an iron bench, splaying his legs out in front of him. "Listen, brother. "Shut up, Ty," he grumbled. He didn't need his brother to tell him what he already knew. He was a failure. Warmth dotted Percy's face like the petals of spring. He could hear birds. Which shouldn't have surprised him, because winter was nearing its end, but it did. It had been so long since he'd heard anything but the lights. He dragged his eyelids open slowly, creaking his neck to the side from the uncomfortable position it had been stuck in for God knew how long. Light frost dusted his jeans and jacket, but the sunlight still poured from the sky. Percy checked his watch, shaking himself awake with vigor when he noticed it had been 4 hours. Shit. He jumped up, shaking blood back into his legs as he jogged back to the hospital doors, barging through them and up to the 3rd floor, 5th room on the right. He knocked gently before swinging the door gently open. Her brothers were still snoring away, Matthew's foot in Bobby's face. Percy smiled, walking over and laying the discarded blanket over them. His mother had gone, as had Frederick. Percy suspected a caffeine break may have been in order. The machines were still beeping steadily as Percy approached the bed, grimacing slightly at the angry bruising. His heart ached. Why had she been on the road? He had found her on the road out of town, towards his place. Had she been coming to see him? Or had she been running away? Percy shook the thought away. It was of no help now. "Wise girl," he murmured quietly, running the back of his hand down her face. "Can you wake up for me, please?" There was no response, just the incessant beep 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 of the heart monitor. "I need you to wake up, Annabeth. I don't know what to do." He leaned his forehead on the edge of her bed, closing his eyes against the sting. "I'm so sorry." Percy didn't know how long he sat there, but his buttoned legs had gone numb and his brain felt like it had shriveled up from crying. He knew he looked like a mess, but quite frankly, he couldn't bring himself to care. At one point, he dragged himself away and went in search of some sticky notes. He found some at the nurse's desk. Pulling out a pen, he started writing anything he could think of. Stupid things. Horrible things. Good things. The best things. All her notes he never responded to, and more. He stuck them to the wall above her head, to the window next to her bed, to her bedpost and to the side of the machines. Pink, yellow and blue post-it notes littered the room like colored gems, each one with scrawly handwriting covering them. Percy held nothing back, it was the least she deserved. He told her everything when he couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. But they spoke from the walls, his story devouring his thoughts, echoing in his mind, haunting him through the writing. But still he did not stop. And he didn't stop until the last sticky note held 2 words, which he pressed gently against her hand. Dear Annabeth. I think you're beautiful. Dear wise girl. I saw you help that bullied kid today. Dear angel. I know I'm an idiot. Dear wise girl. I'm sorry I've been so out of it lately. Dear wise girl. I went to see my brother today. He's not with us anymore. Dear wise girl. I killed him. I'm so sorry. Dear Anna. I hear him every day. Dear Anna. He warned me something was going to happen. But I didn't listen. Dear Annabeth. Today I saw you smile and it made my day. Dear Annabeth. I hate coffee. Dear wise girl. You're the best tutor in the world. Dear Annabeth. Your brothers are unfairly amazing chefs. Dear Annabeth. Are you okay? Dear wise girl. Did you know that blue food is better? Dear beautiful. Did you know that jellyfish have been around longer than dinosaurs? Dear angel. My favorite movie is Finding Nemo. Yours should be too, even though I know it's David Attenborough documentaries. Dear beautiful. I am ashamed to admit that I have hidden under the table maybe more than once. Dear wise girl. I hope one day you can forgive me. Dear angel. I know what it's like for your family to implode. Dear wise girl. I love you. Dear bestest friend. Thank you. Spring was tainting the air with sweet perfume, calling all life to come forth. And, apparently, Percy's allergies. He sneezed as he entered the doors, scaring the poor lady sitting at the desk 2 feet away. Bless me, he mumbled awkwardly, shuffling past her and down the hall. He could find the way by heart now, but that didn't mean he was going to navigate the windy halls with his eyes closed. He was under no illusion that he held any hand-eye coordination skills whatsoever. Softly knocking on the partially open door, he let himself in, smiling widely at the exasperated blonde sitting in the center of the room. "Took you long enough," she grumbled. "Oh hush, I ran all the way here." Annabeth looked at him dubiously. "You haven't even broken a sweat." "I'm a fast recoverer," he laughed, kneeling down in front of her wheelchair. "That's not even a word," she snorted, pushing his face away. Percy chuckled, leaning his hands on the arms of her chair. "So, what are we doing today, Your Highness?" Annabeth rolled her eyes, smiling fondly. "Climbing Mount Everest." "No way, I'm way too unfit for that." Annabeth laughed, but he could tell she was grateful. He knew she tried not to feel self-conscious, but it had taken her a lot of getting used to only having one leg. She had been in physical therapy since she had woken, confused and disorientated, 3 weeks before, and she was making slow and painful progress. The doctors didn't think she would ever walk again. But she was Annabeth Chase, and she was determined. "Even if I have to design the bloody prosthetic myself," she had said. Percy had just smiled like the proud lovesick idiot that he was. She had woken, and no, Percy's heart didn't threaten to stop right then and there, and the first thing she had said was, "Who threw Thor's hammer at my head?" Shortly followed by, "What in the world?" She had, of course, been referring to Percy's rainbow explosion of sticky notes, of which she had later carefully collected and placed in a glass jar that she kept on her windowsill. Percy wasn't glowing with pride or relief at that. He absolutely was not. He swore. With everything laid out bare, damning and vulnerable, she had simply looked at him like he was still everything she had ever believed him to be, and smiled, reaching out her hand. And that, Percy had thought, was why she was the most fantastic human on the planet. Scratch that. She was definitely an angel. Zero doubt. "Maybe we should go to space," she mused aloud. Percy snorted. "Yeah, and go eat cheese on the moon. The moon is made of cheese, you doofus. You don't have to bring it there." Percy breathed out a laugh, gently resting his hand where her knee met thin air, stroking it under the blanket softly. "But don't forget the crackers," he reminded. Annabeth looked slightly uncomfortable at Percy's touch, as she always did when he touched her bad leg. But that didn't deter him. She needed to know that Annabeth minus a leg didn't make her any less Annabeth to him, no matter how long it took for her to believe it. She laughed slightly awkwardly, trying to subtly bat his hand away, but he refused to move it, gently squeezing her knee. "Annabeth," he warned gently, looking her dead in the eye. "Look at me." She wiped a hand down her face, her eyes darting in embarrassment before she met his gaze. "Repeat after me, I am beautiful." "I know you are, Percy. Don't be so full of it." Percy choked on a laugh. "I'm serious, wise girl. We're going back to kindergarten. Repeat please." "Repeat please," she said with a small smile. Percy sighed dramatically. "Fine, play your games. Fine, play your games." Her eyes were shining, and Percy couldn't even bring himself to feel the least bit exasperated. "I am beautiful," he stated. Annabeth paused. "I am beautiful," she mumbled quietly. "I didn't hear that," Percy teased. "I didn't hear that," she smirked. "I am beautiful," he repeated. "I'm beautiful." "Yes, you are," he grinned triumphantly. "Yes, you are," she said softly, catching his eyes. "And we will fly to the moon and eat cheese." She grinned, squeezing her hand over his at her knee. "We will fly to the moon," she stated, throwing her other arm out. "And eat all the cheese. We will become the new moon. Because we will be full of cheese." Annabeth snorted. "You're such a dork. I love you." She stopped, looked at him. Percy held his breath, feeling his eyes scrunch awkwardly as he thought desperately of how to backtrack. Too soon, too soon, too soon. You can't just blurt stuff like that out, you seaweed bray. "I love you," she repeated. brothers knew best. Of this, Percy was certain. He stood next to Annabeth's wheelchair, fingers tugging softly on the end of her curls, looking at his brother's grave, now decorated with an abundance of fresh flowers. It wasn't snowing anymore. "I would have loved you," he murmured. Annabeth breathed a smile. "I love him already. He's a part of you. Listen." Annabeth tipped her head up to Sun, closing her eyes and smiling gently. "It's like I can hear him. Which is crazy and impossible." She laughed lightly, shaking her head. Percy swallowed hard, but didn't shed a tear. Nope. No tears. Just a mild stinging. Mild stinging your foot. Percy looked up, saw the clouds get whisked away by the breeze, saw the early buds of leaves springing from the branches. "Listen, brother. Can you hear the birds?" He paused, tilting his head and laughing in disbelief. He could. Not that he would ever admit that. He wasn't a sap. He swore. "Yes, brother. I hear them. A bird does not sing because it has an answer, it sings because it has a song. Maya Angelou.